All right, well, thank you so much for the invitation to speak here. I love the framework that you introduced up front. I'm going to speak to a couple elements of that framework. Obviously, we only have 10 minutes, so I'm going to focus this on depression, but the same principles we're going to discuss hold true for optimizing, I think, any TMS target. Next slide. So TMS, as you all know, was FDA approved for treatment of depression back in 2008. It's now been 15 years, and we're still targeting TMS based on scalp measurements in my clinic and most clinics around the world. Next slide. So, way back in 2012, Alvaro Pascaleon and I came up with this hypothesis, inspired largely by Helen Mayberg's work, putting DBS electrodes into the subgenual, is that maybe the target for TMS is actually a brain circuit, and we could go to critical limbic nodes like the subgenual cingulate, look at what it's connected to, and use that as a more optimized target for TMS for things like depression. Next slide. And this seemed to line up really well with evidence that we had at the time as far as which targets were a little bit better for depression and which were a little bit worse for depression. Next slide. So Hertzman showed us that this target was a little bit better than next slide. Fitzgerald showed us that this target was a little bit better than this target. Next slide. And then we set out to prospectively test this. So we just started recording the stimulation site from patients that came in through our TMS for depression clinic, testing whether or not the more anti-correlated their stimulation site was to the subgenual. In other words, the more their stimulation site aligned with this pattern of subgenual connectivity, the better they got. And this prospective test worked well in our lab. Next slide. But actually worked slightly better down in Australia with Robin Cash and Paul Fitzgerald. Next slide. And so that led to this idea that this, dorsolateral prefrontal cortex node anti-correlated to the subgenual might actually be an optimal antidepressant target for TMS. And in fact, these coordinates were used in two major trials of TMS for depression. However, in both of these trials, they didn't see a great leap forward. There wasn't any evidence that moving to these specific coordinates actually improved our response rate above scalp-based measurements. And that led us to try to think through, okay, what's missing here? Why did moving to this target not lead to a giant improvement in response or remission rates? Next slide. And so I'm going to talk about three ideas of how we might optimize this TMS target. Next slide. And first is just asking the question whether or not the subgenual was the right target. Way back in 2010, all the excitement was around the subgenual cingulate and Helen Mayberg's DBS implantations. But since that time, we can take a better approach to figure out what our target for depression might actually be, and it may or may not be the subgenual. Next slide. So our approach to backing this out in a data-driven fashion was led by Sean Siddiqui, who looked at a lot of different lesion data sets that either caused depression or didn't cause depression, 4 different TMS data sets where we knew exactly where the stim site was, and we had a metric of depression improvement, and 5 different DBS data sets that measured depression before and after they turned on the electrode. And all of these different data types give us a causal link between the lesion, TMS site, or DBS site. Next slide. And so what Sean did is he said, okay, what do the lesions need to be connected to cause depression? What do the TMS sites need to be connected to make depression better? And what do DBS sites need to be connected to either make depression worse or make depression better? And what he found across these 3 different causal sources of information is that they all converged on one common brain circuit. And you can see the subgenual cingulate is lit up there in green. It definitely seems to be an important node of this circuit, but it's by no means the only node of this circuit. And you can see, especially with the TMS data, there's a whole pattern that you want your TMS coil to be connected to improve your antidepressant response, the subgenual just being one of those nodes. Next slide. The next idea is, okay, maybe we need to personalize this based on individual differences in connectivity. Next slide. And we know that the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex, where we target TMS for depression, is one of the most variable areas in the entire brain based on connectivity. Next slide. So what we did is we looked at connectivity with the subgenual, and obviously you get this nice juicy anticorrelation in the left dorsolateral prefrontal cortex. But when you look at connectivity from individual subjects, we see a lot of variability. And you can do that with just the subgenual, or you can do that with what we call a network seed. Now, this was back from 2013, before we knew what Sean Siddiqui's depression network would actually look like, but it still gives you an idea of the difference between using a subgenual seed and a more distributed network. Next slide. But a critical factor is when you're looking at individualized connectivity, Step one should be looking at the reproducibility of those individualized targets. And what you can see is if you use just the subgenual cingulate as your seed, you get individual differences, but those individual differences are pretty heterogeneous across different days. And that's not surprising. The subgenual is one of the worst signal to noise areas in the entire human brain. If you switch over to a network seed, which you see in the bottom row, you'd see individual differences, but those individual differences are much more reliable and much more reproducible. So I'd encourage anyone thinking about targeting TMS based on individualized connectivity to first look at the reproducibility of their target. Next slide. And you can actually quantify it, and you can show that the reproducibility of the individualized target with a subgenual seed, it's a little bit better than if you were to use a different patient to pick out your TMS target. But there was actually no advantage of using individualized subgenual connectivity over the group-based target. Now, if you use a network seed, there was an advantage. Again, it's just a signal-to-noise improvement. Now, our resting state techniques and processing pipelines have improved since 2013. But again, the take-home point is that you need to make sure your individualized target's actually reproducible. And as we have improved our ability to process, there's been more and more data that suggests that the closer you get your actual TMS site to this individualized target, the better you do. And Robin Cash has a very nice paper on this. This is one from our group and Sean Siddiqui. But Nolan Williams is really the one that took this to the extreme and said, hey, I'm just going to use this. In fact, I'm going to hit it every hour on the hour for 5 days in a row, and developed what he calls the SAINT neuromodulation treatment, which is recently FDA approved for treatment of depression. Conflict of interest, I am a consultant for Magnus, the company that's developing this treatment. But what he found is that if you go to the individualized target, hit it every hour on the hour, you see antidepressant responses that are better than what we had seen in other trials of TMS. Now, Nolan didn't test specifically individualizing based on connectivity. It was part of a broader set of innovations that when combined led to a response rate that seemed to be higher. But again, it does suggest that going to individualized TMS targets might confer an advantage. Next slide. And finally, I want to talk about personalizing based on symptoms. Next slide. And so even if we use the group connectome and look at where different patients were stimulated, we can back out different connections that might be important for different symptoms of depression. Next slide. So for example, these are the connections we need to hit to improve decreased interest. Next slide. A different set of connections to improve feelings of failure. Next slide. And yet a third set of connections to improve sleep problems. Next slide. And when Sean mapped out the set of connections we need to hit to improve different symptoms of depression, what he found is they really clustered into 2 circuit targets. There was one set of connections you need to hit to improve dysphoric symptoms of depression, and a separate set of connections you needed to hit to improve anxiosomatic symptoms of depression. Next slide. And Sean's actually running a randomized clinical trial right now, testing whether we can hit one circuit target to improve one set of depression symptoms or a different circuit target to improve a different set of depression symptoms. Now, again, this is individualizing or personalizing based on symptom profiles, very similar to what we already do with deep brain stimulation for Parkinson's disease, rather than individualizing based on individual differences in connectivity. So I just want to leave you with 2 conclusions after this short talk. Conclusion number 1 is that connectivity may help us identify a better TMS target for depression. But conclusion number 2 is that data-driven networks, individualized connectivity, and symptom specificity may all help in individualizing and optimizing our TMS target for depression. And that these principles that we really explored in depression likely hold true for any neurological or psychiatric symptom that we're trying to treat with a neuromodulation intervention. Just acknowledging my lab and my worldwide network of collaborators. Next slide. And the Center for Brain Circuit Therapeutics at Brigham and Women's. Next slide. And that should be the end. Thank you so much for inviting me.